Tennessee power plant hulked on the fringes of Rhea County like a titan felled by time, its coal-fired heart pulsing through a skeleton of rusted steel and crumbling concrete. In 1998, Carter Riggs called it home, or at least the closest thing to it after his divorce stripped him bare of everything but a battered truck and a taste for solitude. The job was unglamorous. Clock in at dusk, sit in the control room with its flickering screens and stale air, make rounds through corridors that smelled of oil and regret, then clock out as dawn bled over the hills. It wasn't a career to boast about, but it paid the bills, and after 10 years of marriage that ended in shouted silences and slammed doors, the quiet was a balm he couldn't refuse. The plant was ancient, built in an era when coal was king, its smokestacks clawing at the sky, its perimeter swallowed by miles of tangled woods and rolling ridges that seemed to breathe with secrets older than the machinery within. On the night shift, it was a mausoleum, staffed by a skeleton crew of 4 souls tasked with keeping the beast from collapsing under its own weight. That night, Carter would discover that something else prowled the edges of this tomb. Something that didn't answer to the laws of man or nature. The shift unfurled with the predictability of a worn clock. Carter arrived as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and sickly grays, the air heavy with the faint tang of coal dust and the promise of rain that never came. Ray McAllister was already there, a wiry man with a perpetual grin etched into his weathered face, perched in the control room like a sentry over his domain. His thermos sat beside him, ostensibly filled with coffee, but the sharp bite of bourbon wafted from it whenever he took a swig, a secret no one bothered to call out. Ellie Hart trailed Carter on rounds, the new hire with boots too shiny and eyes too wide, her every step a scuff against the concrete that echoed in the plant's hollow guts. She was trying too hard to prove she belonged, her voice clipped and overly bright, as if she could out-talk the shadows that clung to the edges of every hall. Carter, still nursing the raw edges of his own wounds, didn't have the energy to ease her nerves. The corridors stretched endlessly before them, a maze of rusted pipes and gauges that ticked like the pulse of a dying giant, their dim fluorescent lights buzzing faintly, casting pools of yellow that barely dented the dark. Beyond the windows, the night was absolute. Pitch black, a void unbroken by stars or streetlights, pressing against the glass like a living thing. The monitors in the control room offered a dull comfort, their grainy feeds showing empty halls, humming turbines, and the occasional flicker of static that Ray blamed on cheap-ass wiring. The trio settled into their roles. Ray sipping his bourbon-laced brew, Ellie hovering too close to Carter's shoulder, and Carter staring at the screens as if they might reveal some hidden truth about the life he'd stumbled into. The plant's hum was a constant, a low drone that seeped into their bones, a reminder that they were mere caretakers of something vast and indifferent. Outside, the woods loomed, their silhouettes jagged against the horizon, a wall of oaks and pines that swallowed sound and sight with an almost deliberate hunger. It was a night like any other, until 1 a.m., when the silence broke. The exterior motion sensors shrieked to life, a piercing wail that sliced through the control room stupor, jolting Carter from his chair and sending Ellie's hands into a tremble she couldn't hide. These weren't the main alarms. Those would signal a meltdown, a fire, a collapse. But the perimeter sensors, twitchy little bastards designed to catch anything that wandered too close to the fence. The 3 of them crowded around the monitor, eyes locked on the south perimeter's feed, a grainy tableau of chain link and gravel bathed in the sickly glow of security lights. Nothing moved. The cameras panned dutifully, their lenses sharp and functional, but the space beyond the fence was a void. No deer, no raccoons, no drunken locals stumbling through the dark, just emptiness staring back, a blankness that felt too deliberate, too watchful. Ellie's voice cracked, high and brittle. "Is it a glitch?" Ray snorted, leaning back with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Probably a damn squirrel. Systems more sensitive than my ex on a bad day." He waved Carter off when he suggested checking it out, but something gnawed at Carter's gut. A prickle at the base of his skull, an instinct forged in years of nights spent listening to the world's quiet warnings. Alarms didn't just go off. Not out here, where the nearest town was a faint memory and the woods held their breath. He grabbed a flashlight, its weight a cold comfort in his hand, and stepped into the night. The power plant loomed behind him, a monolith of steel and shadow, its smokestack belching faint trails of gray into a sky devoid of stars, the air cool and sharp against his skin. The perimeter lights buzzed overhead, their hum a frail counterpoint to the silence beyond, casting a jaundiced glow that barely touched the blackness. His boots crunched on the gravel, each step a deliberate intrusion into the stillness, the flashlight's beams slicing through the dark like a knife through flesh. He reached the south fence, its chain link standing tall and unyielding. No breaks, no bends, no signs of anything forcing its way through. He swept the light across the ground, dirt, stones. A few stray leaves caught in the wind, nothing out of place. Then it hit him. A smell, faint at first, creeping through the cool air like a whisper. It was sharp and foul, rot laced with a chemical sting. Not the plant's usual sulfur reek, but something alive, something wrong. It clung to the back of his throat, a taste he couldn't spit out, and set his nerves alight with a dread he couldn't name. He scanned the treeline, the beam trembling slightly in his grip, illuminating a wall of oaks and pines that seemed to lean inward, their branches clawing at the dark like skeletal hands. That's when he heard it. A sound, soft and rhythmic, like fabric tearing, drifting from the woods beyond the fence. It wasn't the wind, not the rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig under a deer's hoof. This was deliberate, a sound with intent, pulling at him like a thread begging to be unraveled. He called it in, his voice steady despite the chill creeping up his spine. "Ray, Ellie, got something weird out here. Sound like tearing coming from the trees. You might wanna..." Ray's laugh crackled through the radio, rough with bourbon and bravado. "Don't be a hero, Riggs. Probably just the wind playing tricks." Ellie stayed silent, her absence a weight on the line, a void where reassurance should have been. Carter hesitated, the rational part of him urging him back to the control room's flickering warmth, to Ray's jokes and Ellie's nervous chatter. But the noise, the smell, it was the kind of wrong that didn't dissolve with denial. It demanded witness, and he couldn't turn away. Ducking under a low branch, he crossed the fence line, the gravel giving way to soft earth that sank beneath his boots. The woods swallowed him, the air growing thicker, heavier with that rancid stench. Decay and chemicals entwined, a cocktail that turned his stomach and stung his eyes. Brambles snagged at his uniform, thorns biting into his calves. But he pressed on, the flashlight's beam a frail guide through the tangle of roots and vines. The sound grew louder, a steady rhythm that pulsed in time with his heartbeat, drawing him deeper into the trees. 20 yards in, he found it. The source of the smell, the sound, the dread that had rooted in his chest. A deer lay sprawled across the forest floor, its neck split open from jaw to collarbone, its belly hollowed out in a grotesque parody of a hunter's gutting. But this wasn't a hunter's work, nor a predator's feast. The guts were gone. Not eaten, not scattered by scavengers, but scooped clean with a precision that turned Carter's blood to ice. The cuts were too neat, too surgical, edges smooth as if carved by a blade honed beyond human craft. He'd hunted these woods, skinned deer with his own hands, but this was alien, a violation of nature's messy chaos. The dirt around the carcass was disturbed, not in the frantic clawing of a bear or the sloppy drag of a cougar, but in orderly lines, drag marks stretching deeper into the woods, straight and purposeful, as if whatever did this had a destination in mind. He crouched, the flashlight trembling as he traced the lines with its beam, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, a trail left by something that knew what it was doing, something that didn't fear discovery. He radioed back, voice tight with a fear he couldn't shake. "Ray, Ellie found a deer, torn up bad, guts missing, cuts too clean. Drag marks heading deeper. Something's not right out here." Ray's chuckle rasped through the static. "What, you starring in your own creature feature now, Riggs? Gonna fight off Bigfoot with that flashlight?" But Ellie's voice broke in, small and urgent, cutting through Ray's bravado like a blade. "I'll come out." Carter waited by the carcass, the smell clawing at his throat, a rancid fog that coated his tongue and burned his nostrils. The prickle on his spine sharpened into a blade, a certainty that he wasn't alone. Not just with the deer, but with something watching from the dark. Ellie arrived minutes later, her flashlight trembling in her hands, her face pale as moonlight against the wood's shadows. She stared at the deer, lips parting in a silent gasp, her breath visible in the cool air. "That's not right," she muttered, her voice a threadbare whisper, echoing the thought that had lodged in Carter's mind. He nodded, sweeping his beam over the drag marks. "Let's see where they go." They moved together, stepping over roots and through brambles that clawed at their legs, the woods closing in like a living thing, its branches a lattice that blocked out the sky. The smell grew worse, a wall of decay and chemicals that made their eyes water and their stomachs lurch, a presence as tangible as the trees themselves. The flashlight beams danced ahead, twin spears of light piercing the dark, illuminating a path that felt less like a trail and more like a summons. 50 yards deeper, they found the second body. Not a deer this time, but a man. His clothes hung in tatters, a flannel shirt shredded into ribbons, his chest ripped open with a force that left his ribs gleaming wet and white in the flashlight's glare. His face was frozen mid-scream, a mask of terror etched into flesh, eyes wide and unseeing, staring into a void Carter couldn't fathom. His hands were gone, just stumps, ragged and bloody, the bones splintered as if snapped by something with impossible strength. Ellie gagged, turning away, her flashlight clattering to the ground as she pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath hitching in sharp, panicked gasps. Carter's legs locked, the gore a visceral punch to his gut, a sight that clawed at the edges of his sanity. But it was the drag marks, those same orderly lines stretching away from the body, that turned his fear into something alive, something that pulsed in his veins. Whatever did this wasn't finished. It had taken this man, torn him apart with a precision that mocked the chaos of nature, and left a trail for them to follow, a breadcrumb path into the abyss. His mind reeled, thoughts spiraling too fast to grasp, a torrent of questions crashing against the dam of his comprehension. Who was this man? A hunter? A drifter? And why here, so close to the plant, where the woods should have been empty? Adrenaline surged, a bitter flood that drowned his hesitation and set his nerves ablaze. "We've got to keep going," he said, his voice rough, though he didn't know why. Maybe to find answers, maybe to prove this wasn't a nightmare he'd wake from, maybe because turning back felt like surrender to something he couldn't name. Ellie nodded, retrieving her flashlight with trembling hands, her jaw set despite the terror in her eyes, a flicker of resolve beneath the fear. They pressed on, slower now, every step a gamble against the dark, their beams sweeping the underbrush for signs of movement. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No owls hooting, no crickets chirping, just their breaths and the faint rustle of leaves underfoot, a silence that pressed against their eardrums like a physical weight. The air grew colder, the smell a suffocating shroud that clung to their skin, a promise of horrors yet unseen. Then it came, a wet, heavy sound, like meat slapping against rock, sharp and sudden from beyond a cluster of boulders ahead. Ellie screamed, a raw burst that tore through the stillness, echoing off the trees like a gunshot. Carter's heart slammed against his ribs, his flashlight snapping toward the sound, its beam trembling as he gestured her back. "Stay here," he hissed, but she shook her head, clutching her flashlight like a weapon, her breath ragged but defiant. "I'm not waiting alone." Together, they crept closer, the sound growing louder, a rhythmic butchery that twisted Carter's stomach into knots, a grotesque symphony of flesh and stone. The boulders loomed, their surfaces slick with moss and shadow, a natural barrier that hid whatever lay beyond. They edged around them, the ground soft and yielding beneath their boots, the smell now a physical force that made their heads swim. Beyond the rocks, a clearing opened, a patch of earth stripped bare of grass, ringed by trees that seemed to lean inward, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. In the center, something crouched over another body, its movements jerky and wrong, a predator at work in a scene that defied reason. It was huge, 7 feet tall, even hunched, its arms too long for its frame, dangling almost to the ground, its skin rough and dark like tree bark scorched by wildfire. Its head was a grotesque parody of a wolf's, snout twisted into an elongated maw, teeth too numerous and jagged, protruding at odd angles, blood dripping from them in thick, viscous strands as it tore into its prey. The body beneath it was human or had been. Now it was a ruin of flesh and bone, ribs splayed open like a flower in bloom, guts missing, the same clean cuts Carter had seen before. The creature's claws, long, curved, gleaming like obsidian, worked with a precision that was almost mechanical, slicing through muscle and tendon with a surgeon's grace. Carter's lungs seized, fear locking his breath in his chest, a cold that sank into his bones and rooted him to the spot. Ellie froze beside him, her gasps shallow and ragged, her flashlight beam trembling across the clearing, illuminating the horror in stark relief. The creature didn't notice them at first, too engrossed in its carnage, ripping flesh with a focus that suggested purpose beyond hunger. A ritual, a task, a message carved in blood. Then it stopped, head jerking up, snout sniffing the air with a predator's focus, its movements sudden and deliberate. Carter's mind raced, a frantic scramble for action in the face of something that defied comprehension. He grabbed a rock from the ground, its weight cold and rough in his palm, and hurled it as hard as he could into the trees opposite them. The clatter snapped the creature's attention away, its head whipping toward the sound with a speed that belied its bulk, a low growl rumbling from its throat, a sound that vibrated in Carter's chest like a tuning fork struck by unseen hands. He seized Ellie's arm, pulling her back the way they'd come, her flashlight clattering against roots as they moved. They didn't run. Running would have been too loud, too reckless, but they retreated fast, low and quiet, weaving through the underbrush with a desperation born of survival. Every step felt like an eternity, every shadow a threat poised to lunge, the creature's presence a weight in the air that pressed against their backs. The forest seemed to shift around them, branches snapping into place behind them, the silence deepening into a void that swallowed their gasps. They reached the fence, breathless and shaking, the plant's security lights a frail beacon against the dark. Ray waited there, his face drained of color beneath the harsh glow, his thermos forgotten on the gravel. "What the hell?" he started, his voice cracking, but Carter cut him off, sharp and urgent. "Call the sheriff. Lock down the plant. Now." Ellie stared back at the woods, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if expecting the thing to burst through the trees, its claws dripping with the blood of the man it had claimed. Carter's hands trembled as he gripped the fence, the cold metal grounding him against the chaos in his mind. The sheriff's department arrived within the hour, their trucks kicking up dust on the dirt road that wound through the hills, flanked by state wildlife agents in khaki vests, their flashlights slicing through the dark like scalpels. Carter and Ellie led them back, retracing their steps through the woods, the drag marks still etched into the earth, the smell a lingering specter that guided their path. The clearing was empty when they arrived, the creature gone, but the evidence remained. Torn flesh, clean cuts, a body reduced to a grotesque tableau of violence. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Hargrove with a face like weathered leather, crouched by the remains, his flashlight illuminating the carnage in stark detail. "What the hell did this?" he muttered, more to himself than to them, his voice rough with a mix of disbelief and dread. The officials worked methodically, taking photos that flashed like lightning in the dark, collecting samples in plastic bags. Blood, tissue, a shard of bone that gleamed too white against the dirt. They asked 100 questions that blurred into noise. Where were you when it started? What did it look like? How fast did it move? Carter answered as best he could, his voice flat, the words hollowed out by exhaustion and fear. Ellie stood apart, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the treeline, silent as the agents scribbled notes and murmured among themselves. Over the next few days, they found more bodies, 3, then 5, then 7 scattered deeper in the forest, each bearing the same wounds, the same precision, the same drag marks leading nowhere. The victims were varied. A hunter in camo, a hiker with a backpack still strapped to his shoulders, a woman in a torn dress that suggested she'd been running from something long before the creature found her. The woods became a graveyard, a map of horrors etched into the earth, and yet the thing itself remained a ghost, a shadow that slipped through their nets. The official report came a week later, plastered across local papers and whispered in diners over plates of biscuits and gravy. Animal attacks, they said, a rogue bear driven mad by hunger or disease. The clean cuts were chalked up to unusual predation patterns, the drag marks dismissed as wind or scavengers, the chemical smell ignored entirely. The plant tightened security, installing new cameras and floodlights that bathed the perimeter in a harsh, unyielding glare, but it didn't matter. Ellie quit 2 days later, her resignation a single line scrawled on a napkin left on the control room desk. "I can't stay here." Ray lasted a week, his bourbon no match for the shadows that crept into his dreams, his grin replaced by a haunted stare that followed him out the door. Carter stayed a month, driven by a need to know, to see if it would return, to prove it wasn't a figment of his unraveling mind. It didn't come back, not while he was there, but the smell lingered, sharp and chemical, carried on the wind from the wood's edge, a reminder that refused to fade. Years later, in 2024, Carter sat in a dimly lit bar in Lexington, Kentucky, nursing a beer that had gone warm in his hands. Across the table, Barrett Crowder leaned forward, his forearms scarred from years of utility work, his eyes hollow with a story that mirrored Carter's own. Barrett had been a foreman in the Daniel Boone National Forest, overseeing a crew tasked with repairing storm-damaged transmission lines in a stretch of woods so dense it seemed to swallow the sky. That night, under floodlights that buzzed like dying flies, he'd seen it too. A creature too tall, too fast, its claws carving gashes into poles and flesh alike. Gordon's body slumped against a tree, chest shredded, blood soaking the earth. Naomi and Jace vanished in a truck overturned in a ditch, claw marks raked across its steel hide. The forest had closed in, the air thick with a smell Barrett couldn't place. Sharp, chemical, wrong. In Oregon's Wolf Creek Pass, Carl Dennison, a lineman with a steady hand and a skeptic's heart, found Dan Rafferty's remains beneath a canopy of Douglas firs, a thing with jagged teeth watching from the shadows. The creature's silhouette haunted his rearview mirror as he fled, its presence a stain on the photos he'd taken, blurred but undeniable. In Wisconsin's Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, another Carl Dennison, no relation, chased a lead for a local paper, only to find Drew Larson's body torn apart. Deer strung high in the trees like morbid trophies, their guts missing, their bones snapped clean. Minnesota's Boundary Waters had Garrett Lynn's nightmare, a wildlife surveyor whose cameras captured blood-smeared lenses and a silhouette too vast to be a wolf, his camp emptied by a force that crushed skulls and erased evidence. Daniel Harcourt, a forest ranger in northern Minnesota, stumbled on a bone-strewn clearing near Trailhead 5, human remains scattered like toys, silenced by men in suits who left him with a check and a gag order. Arizona's Kaibab National Forest claimed a hiker's sanity in 2006, David King fleeing a creature that gutted a man and left a woman broken, its claws glinting in the sunlight as he snapped blank photos. Alaska's Tongass National Forest took Theo from David King's trail crew in 1993. His body torn apart in a cave of scratched walls, the thumping of something massive echoing through the trees. Washington's Okanagan Wenatchee left Carter Mulligan with a limping dog and a mind scarred by a thing with bark-like skin, its scars a testament to battles won, its bones arranged in patterns that defied reason. Montana's Bitterroot Mountains devoured Dean Kessler's hunting party in 2011, Mitch, Doug, and Brady falling to a creature that hunted not for food but for dominance, its claws slicing through flesh and steel with equal ease. These stories stitch a tapestry of dread, threads of claw marks, clean cuts, and that sharp, chemical smell weaving across decades and states, a pattern too vast to dismiss as coincidence. Each man carried a shard of the same nightmare, a glimpse of something that defied taxonomy. A predator, yes, but more than that, a presence with intent, a force that carved its will into the world with surgical precision. What would you do if you stepped into a forest where the silence screams louder than the wind, where the earth bears scars no animal could carve, where the air tastes of rot and ruin? Would you chase the truth, flashlight trembling in your hand, or turn back, praying the shadows don't follow you home? Carter Riggs chased it and he survived, but survival isn't peace. The thing in Tennessee's woods didn't vanish. It waits, its hunger a quiet pulse beneath the soil, its purpose a riddle written in blood and bone. The power plant still stands, its turbines humming through the night, its lights a frail shield against the dark that presses in from all sides. Locals whisper of missing hikers, of hunters who vanish with their dogs, their gear found scattered like offerings to an unseen god. The official reports pile up, bears, cougars, accidents. But the truth seeps through the cracks, carried on that wind that smells of chemicals and death. Carter left Rhea County, but the smell follows him, a ghost in his lungs, a scar on his soul that itches in the quiet hours. Barrett's hands tremble in Kentucky, Carl's photos blur in Oregon, Garrett's dreams replay in Minnesota, Daniel's silence weighs in Minnesota, David's knife rusts in Arizona, Carter Mulligan's dog limps in Washington, and Dean's rifle gathers dust in Montana. They all know it's out there. Not one creature, but many, or one vast thing wearing many skins, its red eyes glinting in the spaces between trees, its claws poised to write the next chapter. The evidence is undeniable. The drag marks, orderly and purposeful. The cuts, clean as a scalpel's edge. The bodies left as messages rather than meals. Science calls it impossible. Bears don't wield blades, wolves don't arrange bones, but the forest doesn't kneel to science. It cradles its secrets in roots and shadows, and those who stumble into them pay a price. Silence, disappearance, or a lifetime of looking over their shoulder, waiting for the sound of tearing fabric, the slap of meat on rock. The Tennessee night Carter faced the creature wasn't an end. It was a beginning, a crack in the world that widened with every tale. Barrett's crew dwindled, Carl's truck roared away. Garrett's camp emptied, Daniel's clearing vanished, David's sanity frayed, Carter Mulligan's dog whimpered, Dean's hunters fell. One by one, the forest claimed its due. The plant's floodlights burned brighter now, their glare a desperate attempt to push back the dark. But the woods remain untouched, endless and hungry, their depths a canvas for horrors that defy name or reason. Carter's flashlight beam still cuts through his dreams. Ellie's scream echoes in his ears. Ray's laugh fades into silence, and the creature's teeth gleam in the dark, waiting for the next soul to cross the fence. It's not a bear, not a wolf, not a myth. It's something older, something that knows the land better than the men who tread it, something that hunts with a purpose beyond survival. The red dots of its presence pulse across an unseen map, a cancer spreading through the wild places of the world, a shadow too vast to grasp. If you walk those trails, listen for the silence, smell the air, feel the weight of eyes you can't see, the rhythm of steps you can't place. And if you hear that tearing sound, that wet slap of meat on rock, ask yourself, are you brave enough to look, or wise enough to run? The answer might not save you, but it'll define the moment the forest decides your fate.